Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in to today's show, and it should be a good one as always. We'll be talking about Thursday Night Football one day in advance. We'll be talking about it from a general betting perspective. Then I'm going to give you some popular prop bets that might be able to hit for you tomorrow night. I'm going to conclude my positional rankings, my weekly positional rankings, with the tight ends and defenses and special teams units that I think will define the fantasy football weekend. And speaking of defining the fantasy football weekend, I give my weekly shadow report, my final segment, the key wide receiver cornerback matchups that you're going to have to determine in terms of winning the week from a fantasy perspective. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you that if you want more content such as this or other podcasts to enjoy here on the network, consider liking, following, and subscribing to both the show and the network. But if you want to interact with this particular podcast or others on a more direct level, make use of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features. The best way to do it. You can do one of two things. You can either click the dollar sign in the comment section, leave a tip or donation, or you can also make yourselves available to just commenting, whether it be questions, comments, or concerns throughout the show itself. And that's a great way to contribute and interact with the show and make it that much better. But without further ado, let us jump into today's show. And let's start off talking about tomorrow night's game between the Texans and the Jets here. Thursday Night Football should be a very interesting game. Now, before we get into the whole outlook of this game, let me get into the betting perspective here. And the New York Jets, a surprising 2-point favorite in this one, the over-under being 42.5. Houston minus 110, New York Jets minus 110. So pretty even money lines there. But let's get into why it feels like the Jets can be favored in this game and why people are going to tend to bet more on them in this game than the Texans. Obviously, the number one reason is the fact that Stephon Diggs will not play in this game. In fact, he will not play for the rest of the season with a torn ACL, and thus that eliminates one more receiver from that Texans wide receiver room. Now it's just down to Tank Dell, Robert Woods, and rookie Xavier Hutchinson. So that does not necessarily look like a wide receiver core with much promise headed into this game against a vaunted Jets defense. However, the reason why I feel like the Texans are in this game is because they're the team that feels like it has an identity no matter who is playing for them. Whereas the Jets, I have no sympathy for whether they're favored or not. And it's a harsh reality for Jets and especially for Jets fans watching this show to hear, but I'm just telling it like it is. This is a team that is not run like a team. This is more of an organization who is willing to fill the needs of certain players to satisfy them at the risk of underperforming or not performing up to their standards. Whereas the Texans, nobody really expected them to look this good over the past 2 years, what with the new head coach, the new quarterback last year in Stroud, and to be at this point where they're now expected to beat inferior teams and cement themselves as someone who can contend in not just the AFC, but in the Super Bowl race as well. So that is why I feel like you can never count out the Texans, no matter how dire the situation. But when I look at this game, and I see it in terms of what the future could hold, win or lose for both of these teams, it certainly feels like the Texans have more of a point to prove than the Jets, because we now know the Jets' struggles. We don't necessarily know how the Texans, especially in a much weirder 6-2 start than a lot of people would have expected for them going forward. So this game certainly feels like it should be a must-win for the Jets, but it's also a must-win for the Texans because their schedule is deceivingly tough down the stretch. There are some winnable games in there, but there are some very tough games mixed in as well. if I pull up their schedule here to talk about, there definitely are some pratfalls they could fall into. Because after this game, they play the Lions, the Cowboys, they play the Titans twice. They have the Jaguars and Dolphins mixed in as well. And then they end the season with the Chiefs, the Ravens, and the Titans again. So there are going to be some difficult stretches for the Texans this season. It's not going to be all sunshine and rainbows. So this game certainly needs to be a game they feel they can win to kind of have them going in the right direction. Because this season has not felt like a 6-2 season, if you know what I mean, for the Texans. It's felt like a season where luck plays a huge factor into the outcome of Texans games, where you gotta love the fact that they have the ability to come back against certain teams, but you don't necessarily want that to be something you have to rely upon week in, week out. You need games where you can take care of business as quickly as possible. This feels like one, but now it just got a lot harder, what with the fact that Stephon Diggs is no longer catching balls for you this season. And so that's why I feel like a lot of bettors are hopeful and optimistic the Jets can prove them right for at least one of these games. Because now, on paper, they're the more talented team. And so Vegas is quick to believe that talent can equate to success in games such as this, where one team has the superior feel to it, has the superior identity, but the other has an assortment of players that, when they're on their game, can, at the end of the day, steal some wins. And that's what the Jets certainly feel like in certain moments. But the reason why I'm not as sympathetic about them as, say, other teams who could have been in the same situation is because of the fact that it's not a team anymore. This is an assortment of guys who can't decide how they want to play or understand how to operate together as one collective. There's a difference between the Jets' organizational hierarchy and the actual team structure that is leading to a disconnect on the field. And until they figure some modicum or iota of success out, then this team, even in games where you feel like they can be in it, won't necessarily translate onto the field. And so that's why I feel like the Texans should not be underestimated in this game in the slightest, because they have that identity, no matter how rough it's looked this season, how shaky that identity has proven to be. I still think, they have a better formula to account for certain things than the Jets do to try and figure out the mess they're in. So that's why, me personally, I still will pick the Texans in this game. However, there's something to be said about this spread where it's not like the Jets are favored by that much. The line only moved by 1 point over the past couple of days since I've written this down. So, as you can see, there are ways in which you can justify the Jets, because it's not necessarily sweat off your back if, say, this is a 3 to 5 point game, because you can tell that this money line, this over-under, this spread in particular can certainly hit. It's just a matter of, actual talent equating to actual success is my issue here. Because I want to like the Jets in games such as this, where they seemingly have the advantage. But you have to think about certain ways that they can shoot themselves in the foot, because they always find different ways to. And until they prove that they can overcome those odds and actually find some moments of success and be able to sustain that success through certain games, then I'm sitting here telling you that you shouldn't bet for them, because of the fact that even though there will be games in the future where it'll be tough to ignore them, going up against certain teams. Even if those teams aren't as depleted as the Texans are now, I will still say be cautionary about betting for the Jets or betting on the Jets because they're just such a fickle team that I don't even know can be described as a team right now, considering the state of that entire organization and considering the direction they seem to be heading. There is no sense of upside to this Jets team right now, and until they prove me wrong on a football field, I don't necessarily know how these players, no matter how talented they are, can prove that they can play as a collective instead of, create a certain tension around this team that's been there since day one. And I feel like, yes, I could look pretty foolish come Friday for making this prediction just because of the fact, the Jets can at any certain moment turn the Jets on. No pun intended, but I feel like this isn't the time. I feel like the Texans are a team that by hook or by crook seemingly find their identity in certain situations. Even when they're down and out, they always come back to this collective whole that can win football games in many different ways. It hasn't been pretty to start the season. This could be a 2-6 football team as much as it can be a 6-2 one. But they just find ways to win in certain situations that make me feel like in games such as this, even as depleted as they are, they should still be considered the favorites. So I feel like the Jets can cover the spread, and I feel like they will. It's going to be a very close game, but I still have the Texans winning it just because of that narrative to them, that cultural kind of moxie that they have compared to what the Jets are right now that will lead them to victory in this one. We know what you think of the comments about this game. Going to be a good one, but coming up on the other side, I'm going to continue talking about Thursday Night Football, but more from a prop bets perspective, which players will step up or step down in tomorrow night's game. We'll be right back to talk about this right after the break. Don't go anywhere.
I feel like I'm losing my mind.